We're going to have Wally Cortese. He's going to be speaking as our World War II veteran and Korean veteran. Just a short introduction about how I met Wally. Many of you have already heard it, but I love telling it. I was asked by Doris, his wife, if I wanted to go to a Lincoln Reagan dinner, and I went to it and I knew no one. And I walked in and it was full of people because Lieutenant Colonel Allen West was speaking. And there was a gentleman sitting at a table and there wasn't anybody around him, and I thought, gee, I don't know who I'm going to sit with, but there's this nice man sitting there. So I went over and I said, excuse me, does there happen to be an available chair? And he said yes. So we had a delightful conversation. We listened to Lieutenant Colonel Allen West, and a couple days later I was in the Republican office and I was speaking with Doris, and she said, well, how'd you like the dinner? I said, well, the food was good and the speaker was good, but I met this great guy. I said, he was just awesome and I had the best time talking to him. She says, well, who was he? And I said, his name was Wally Cortese. She said, that's my husband. So I'm sure glad we hit it off, because it might have been good. So thank you, Wally, for your friendship. Thank you so much. And then another person that I met that I felt very fortunate, I got to campaign for Spencer Roach. And he's our representative in District 79, soon to be in 76. So make sure if you see his name on the ballot, vote for him too. So I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jermaine. I want to make sure that you can all hear me well. Fine. I am so honored, and I tell you from my heart, to be able to speak to you. And thanks to Jermaine and to Peg, the honor is all mine that I have this opportunity to share with you my life. This coming August 1st, I will be 97 years old. Yeah. You know, and when I'm with my grandchildren, you know, they all say, Papa, you're our hero. And you are a hero. And I say to them, no, the real heroes are the ones that we left behind. And to start off, tell you a little bit about how I got involved with the United States Navy. I was 17 years old and I went to my dad and I said, I'm going to join the Navy. He said, well, you can't do that without my signature. And I said, well, I'm here to ask you to sign. Well, he deliberated and said, you sure you want to do this? And I said, yes. And he signed and I went in the Navy. But I want to go back a little bit to let you know that my dad came over to the USA because he was told in Italy that the streets are paved with gold in America. And he came over here ahead of my mom and my sister and brother, who were both born there. My sister being 12 years my senior, and my brother 10 years my senior. So I was not born yet. So anyhow, they came on over and I was born 2 years later. My mom passed away. And for years and years and years, as I was growing up, I thought I was the one that caused her death, because she died in childbirth. So, and for a long time I thought that, you know, until I finally grew up and realized that it was another child. But anyhow, being the only one in the family that was born in the USA, I was raised in a dual language house, speaking mostly in Italian. So my grandchildren said to me, how, and many other people said, what do you owe your longevity to? And I said, well, you know, there's only one person that I can really say I owe my longevity to, is Lord God and Jesus Christ. So, and you know, there's one other person, and that is my wife of 67 years, Doris, who, without her support and love and understanding, I wouldn't be standing here. But anyhow, back to my Navy. And I went through boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois. And when I was done, I got boot leave and I went home for my boot leave. And when I got my orders, I was told to go down to New Orleans. When I got to New Orleans, I got future orders which sent me to San Juan, Puerto Rico. So I then caught a ship, ended up in San Juan at the Naval Air Station. Well, I served there for 3.5 months, and down came a summons, I guess you'd call it, of anybody who would like to volunteer for the gunnery school, which is just down the road in Rio Pedras. And I volunteered for gunnery school. Little to not knowing that I would end up being in the back seat of an SBD. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with naval aircraft, but SBD had the pilot up in front and the gunner in back. And so in my training, after I was there for, I believe, if memory serves me, 6 weeks to 8 weeks, I got my first ride in an SBD. And while we were up in the air, the pilot said to me, "This is your first time, eh, Gunner?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Look down there." And I looked over and he said, see that box down there?" I said, "Yeah, I see that box down there." "What is it?" "Oh," I said, "that's a carrier." He said, "Yeah, in a few minutes we're going to be landing on that." I said, "Are you kidding me? That looks like a matchbox." Well, obviously, as we got down closer, it became evident that it was the flat top, and we proceeded to land on it for the first time. But you know, then after that, we went on gunnery training flights and so on, and I got accustomed to that. But anyhow, the SBD ended up being the aircraft that had the most tonnage in the entire war. Well, from that point, I got orders to go to Africa. So they flew me over there, and I joined an air wing, which was an air sea rescue and bomber submarine patrol squadron, made up of PB-Ys and PB-4Ys. A PB-4Y is a sister ship to a B-24. A lot of people that were not aware that Navy aircraft incorporated PB-4Ys. So anyhow, I was a gunner on that ship, on that plane, and we did submarine patrol. Now, at that time, the war had progressed, and the beachhead had formed in Normandy. Now, how many here in the audience know what the second front was? Anyone?
Got a few hands in the back.
Oh, okay. What was it?
What was it, Dr. Pitts? Everyone went silent when we asked the question while he got planted.
Okay, anyhow, the second front was the Anzio landing in Italy, and that established the second front. Well, what they did, they took, you know, and many pay grades over me, coordinated all the aircraft in the area to form the bombing of Salerno and the beachhead for the landing. And I can tell you this, I was sitting in the tail gun position, and I looked down, and I only saw a huge cloud moving below me. And it was all the number of aircraft that had been summoned together to form the Thunder Herd. And we just bombed that beachhead for the forthcoming landing. I then was sorted with that air wing. They transferred me from the PB-4Ys to PB-Y for air sea rescue. Prior to that Anzio landing, I was in submarine watch over the Mediterranean. And then I was returned to PBY's and finished out my service at in the PBY's Air Sea Rescue. Then got out of the Navy at that time, and a friend of mine came to me and said, "You know what, Wally? We ought to take and join the reserves." And his name was Norman. And I said, "What do you want to do that for?" "Oh, then we can go bar hopping, and you know." I said, "Well, okay, let's join the reserves." So you might know what happened. We joined the reserves. I get recalled. Norm doesn't. So, you know, so as luck had it, he did not go, and I went back to Great Lakes. But I didn't do a thorough boot camp. It was more shots to prepare me for overseas. So anyhow, I was then ordered to go to Bremerton, Washington, where we recommissioned the CVE 115, which is the USS Barroco. Now, those who don't realize or know, a CVE is a baby carrier. CVE standing for escort. Escort, the E is escort. And we went to sail from there to San Diego, where we picked up the remainder of our crew. And a week later, they loaded our ship with F-16s. They were the first jet aircraft. Now, you got to remember what happened. During that time, we evolved from propeller-driven aircraft to jet aircraft. And so we were the first planes, jet aircraft, that ended up in the Korean conflict. Now, bear in mind that the ship itself, the Barroco, had wooden decks and arresting gear for propeller-driven aircraft. Now here we are boarding jet aircraft. So once we get to Yokosuka, Japan, and remember at that time the Army was the Air Force. It was not Air Force at that time, it was Army Air. So we were then unloaded the F-16s on flight cars to take over to the Army Air Base, and then we were ordered to go to Hangnam in Korea to evacuate the wounded. I can only say that at that time, you know, my experience and my exposure was mainly, you know, working on aircraft and doing things of that nature. I was an aircraft mechanic, machinist, and we got to Hangnam. And any of you who have been on a carrier, the landing deck is above, and the below is called the hangar deck. Our interior hangar deck was covered with wounded that we evacuated from Korea. We took them back over on the other side to Sasebo, and there we evacuated the wounded. And at that time, we were supposed to get our air wing, and somebody, many grades over me, decided, wait a minute, our incoming air wing are jets, and we only have arresting gear for prop driven. So back to Yokosuka we go, and we then in turn put in the netting for jet aircraft from propeller aircraft. So basically at that point we converted all the arresting gear for jets, and then we received our air wing and we returned to Korea for confrontation at that time. Of course, you know, back then it was called police action in Korea, not a war. But basically that summarizes my career in the service. I got out and went on home. I think one of the interesting things that I can retell to you is in the many years of growing up that I lived through Prohibition and all the things that went with that. I was just a kid, but I still remember the speakeasies and bootleg gin and things of that nature. And I remember the hard times that people were going through. And I know that many of you have heard of these stories, but can you imagine going back with me and thinking of unemployment at 30%? Yeah, and that's what I grew up with. And I can remember, I'll retell you a little story. There's another little incidental one I want to throw in here. At that time I was 8 and a half, 9 years old. And we lived in a house that, what heated it was a pot stove. And we had to throw coal in it and so on and so forth. My brother, who was 10 years older, he and I would go at the railroad crossing and swear at the engineer and the fireman, and they'd throw coal at us. So we'd take the coal back home and heat the house with it. But, and now I grew up, I said, you know what? I wonder if those guys really got angry or they knew we needed the coal. So, and the other little part of the story is, the street that I lived on, 8 and 9 years old, the street name was Doris.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, lo and behold, my wife of 67 years is Doris.
Wally, I have to ask you, and I know Doris, and I would say it's fair to say she's very strong-willed. Was Doris a one-way avenue?
No, but Doris is a one-way woman. But anyhow, that's a little incidental thing I throw in. So anyhow, I grew up in that age and grew up through Prohibition, grew up through the Depression, and I am so glad to be able to share a little of my life with you. And when I say it is a privilege to me that I have lived to the age where I can tell stories that are so meaningful in my memories. Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate your attention. A couple more questions here. Thank you.
You're already getting a standing ovation, Wally.
Thank you so much.
Folks, so you can see here at 97 years old, Wally was born at a time when we had 48 states in the Union. He was born shortly after the end of the Woodrow Wilson presidency. But you can see here that his mind is sharp, his eyes are clear, and his heart is full. A true American hero, Wally Cortese.
Thank you so much. Did you have more questions?
Yes, sir. We got a few questions for you, Wally.
Okay.
It's appropriate that we're doing this right after the 4th of July and right after this big box office hit, Top Gun 2, Maverick. I hope you all have seen it, but I think the reason the movie is so popular, it's pro-America, it's pro-military, it's patriotic, and it doesn't have any of this sort of woke culture in it. But I'd like to ask you if you could talk to the audience about, maybe a little bit about, in your childhood in the 1920s and 30s, how has America changed for the better or for the worse, in your opinion? And I think there's some changes on both sides, but what do you think is better now, and what do you think maybe is worse now in today's America than when you were a child?
Well, you got to remember a couple of things. I was born in an era when if you owned a refrigerator, man, you were wealthy. Because what we had was ice box. And my dear old dad would say, ice a box. But amazing little story. An ice box, you got ice by putting a card in your window, a four-sided card, and it had in each section of the four sides the size of block of ice that you wanted the iceman to bring. 25, 75, 100 pounds, so on. And when you put that in the ice box, it would melt and it go down a little pipe and drain into a pan that was under the ice box to catch the water. Well, one of my chores was to make sure that that pan was emptied, otherwise it would overflow and make a mess in the kitchen. So at the time we had moved to a lower flat. And so I said, wait, man, I gotta empty this thing. Empty it every day. What a pain. So I said, wait, I can take and get a Yankee drill a hole in the floor, put a funnel under there, and let it drip into the basement. No pan to empty. So I did that. And I thought, for a 10-year-old kid, or 11, I might have been 11, that's a pretty ingenious idea. And I told my dad, so proud, man, look, I don't have to empty the pan anymore. Man, I got the beating of my life. That floor doesn't belong to you. We're renting this house for this flat. So that's a little story that goes along. And you know, so does anybody, here's a question. Do you remember an entertainer who had the nickname of Banjo Eyes? Anybody?
Eddie Canner.
Eddie Canner. That's right. Wow. Eddie Canner was a famous radio show host that sang, that had his show every Sunday night. And so that was a name that was very fond because we used to gather around the radio to listen to Eddie Canner's show. Now, though, you know, he was asking the good things, well, the radio, the refrigerator, so many things that, TV, are you kidding? The only guy who had anything like a TV was Dick Tracy, who had one on his wrist, you know. So these, I've seen so many things evolve in my lifetime that, you know, do you want to talk about bad things? I'll tell you really, really a bad thing. Joe Biden.
That is about as close as you're going to come to a mic drop moment for a 97-year-old. That is right on. And you know, it's interesting when I hear you talk about how the technology has advanced and now everyone has a broadcast studio in their front pocket. And I think for young people today, if anyone is ever watching this video in years hence, when you talk about the struggle that you went through, the sacrifices of the Great Depression era, and for kids now, they get upset if they can't get Wi-Fi. It's just a different sort of mindset. And I want to transition now and ask you a little bit about your experience in the war. And my grandfather was drafted into Korea, and for his whole life, my grandfather went to church, went to mass every single Sunday. And as a kid, we used to sort of gently chide him about, oh, you know, Pops, why you can't ever miss a mass. And he had told me one time that when he was in a foxhole in Korea, he made a deal with God that if God would get him back safely, he would go to church every Sunday that he was able, and he honored that promise to God and went every Sunday of his life that he was able to. But I wanted to ask you, when you were in combat, how did it affect your faith? Did you ever question your faith? Did it reinforce your faith in God? Or what was your relationship like when you thought you might face death as a young man?
You know, I guess you feel when you're at that age and you're so gung-ho about your country that you would think anybody would do what they did. You just felt invincible. You felt invincible, but you always knew that there was a God that was watching over you. And in my experience, You know, whenever we took off, I always said, God, bring me back safely. So, you know, you have to, I always fought with this problem. When people are confronted with hard times or a death or whatever, how can they go through life without that leaning power that you receive from God? I don't know how they do it without it. And that's how I felt in the service.
Thank you. Amen. And I want to ask you, this is kind of a double question. What was your job when you got back from the war? What did you do for a living? And then part two would be, how did you meet your lovely wife of, I think you said 67 years. How did you meet Doris?
Well, let me answer the question front ways. I met Doris when she was babysitting with my nephew and nieces. And I walked in on her and she was in the house and she didn't know me from Adam. And she looked up at me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "My brother is the one that owns this house." And that's how I met her. And my job at that time was a printer apprentice. So I cut my teeth on the printing industry, and that's what I grew up on. And that's how my second career after the service.
And when you met Doris, and I think there's only one right answer to this question, was it love at first sight, Wally?
Oh, yeah.
Good, right answer. We would have to rewind the tape and do that one again.
The other thing I learned very, very quickly the correct answer to anything that Doris says: yes, dear.
A lot of us in this room have learned that answer too without the dear. Yes, Doris. Couple final questions as we wrap up here. You know, do you feel optimistic about the future of the country?
I would say this, Vince. After the last election, I was brokenhearted. I couldn't believe that in our great country, I thought this result is a third world result. How in the world can this happen in the country that I served for? Am I living in America? No. And it was so disheartening. I think that there's a great future still. And the only reason I say that is that God is leading us. And we have to put our faith in Him. We cannot take the, excuse my French, the crap that's coming down the tube. We have to remember that America comes first and always.
And I guess this is my last question, and then I'll ask you to share with the audience any final thoughts that you may have. So there's I think a crisis. There's a book called the Boy Crisis out right now, which I've been reading, and it's about this crisis that we're having in young men. And you see this with these random and gratuitous acts of violence around the country. But young men now are facing, a crisis in education. They're I think twice as likely to drop out of school as young women. They're 6 times as likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. They're suffering from fatherlessness, and they're suffering from this epidemic of purposelessness. We've got these young men that feel like they don't have a purpose in society. Mm-hmm. And with your 97 years of wisdom and experience, what advice would you give to a young man these days who maybe did not come from a loving family with a supportive father who would take them to the woodshed when they drilled a hole in the floor? But to a young person, a young man who's confused and aimless and purposeless, what advice would you give to a young man today?
Try to remain focused. Try to remain dedicated to the country that you live in. Think about all the beautiful, wonderful things that God has given you, and in turn, think how you can give it back. Think about the many ways that you can say to your country, thank you. Thank you, and I love living in the great US of A.
Your patriotism is very, very evident. And I guess we'll wrap it up now. I'd like to ask you, is there any final thoughts that you want to share with this audience about your life, your childhood, this country, anything else you want to communicate and let them know about Wally Cortese here? And I'll tell you what, during this whole thing, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, you have commanded, I think, the respect and the attention of this audience. But the final question, the floor is yours, Wally.
Well, in closing, you know, it's difficult for me to relate my heartfelt thanks, because it goes deep. It goes deep inside of me. I am so proud and so humble that I was able to serve my country. That I just, it's humbling, and it makes me feel I didn't do enough. How can I ever repay everything that you've given to me? And so I can only leave it with thank you very, very much for the country that I live in, and be damned if the people are going to take away any of that from me, ever.
And I would posit you're still serving. Wally Cortese, a true American hero, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Wally.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention, and I was honored to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wally. Thank you.
We have some memorabilia from Wally's life and wartime service. If you want to come up and see that after we adjourn. Thank you. I'll hand back over to Jermaine.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. Yes, he's got some great pictures of him with his father in his uniform and some ribbons. So if you'd like to walk up and see him, that would be nice. And with that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting.